The village of Fenhurst Parva was not the kind of place that announced itself. There was no grand gateway, no market cross, no public house facing the green with any particular sense of civic pride. There was only the lane, narrowing as it always had, and the hedgerows pressing in from either side as though the countryside were slowly reclaiming what it had temporarily lent. Miss Marple had been brought to Fenhurst Parva by a letter, not a long letter. Dolly Prescott had never been capable of long letters, but a letter of sufficient urgency to make Jane Marple set down her mending, read it twice, and go quietly to the drawer where she kept the train timetables. "You must come, Jane," Dolly had written, in the large, unsteady hand of a woman who had once had excellent penmanship, and now, at 71, allowed it certain freedoms. "Something is wrong at Fenhurst Hall. I cannot explain it in a letter. There have been Sunday luncheons. Sir Edmund insists on them every fortnight, and something happens at these luncheons that I cannot name, but which I feel in my bones. You will know what it is. You always do." Miss Marple had known Dolly Prescott for 52 years. She had not always agreed with her. She had occasionally found her tiresome, but she had never known her to be fanciful about her bones, and so here she was, stepping off the branch line train at the little halt station at Fenhurst, where Dolly's nephew Roger was waiting with an old Ford and an expression of mild alarm. Roger Prescott was 34, a solicitor's clerk in Ipswich who came to Fenhurst on weekends to look after his aunt, and, Miss Marple suspected, to preserve his eventual inheritance from being given away to stray cats. He was not an unkind young man. He was the kind of young man who did his duty thoroughly and without imagination, which was, in its own way, a form of virtue. "Miss Marple," he said, taking her bag with practised efficiency, "Aunt Dolly is very pleased you've come. She's been— well, she hasn't been quite herself." "Has she not?" said Miss Marple. "She's got it into her head that someone at the Hall is— I don't know how to put this— up to something. Her words, not mine." He opened the car door. "I think it's the luncheons. Sir Edmund's Sunday luncheons. She goes every fortnight and comes home unsettled." "Unsettled how?" Roger considered this as he started the engine. "Watchful," he said at last. "As though she were waiting for something to happen." Miss Marple looked out at the lane and said nothing. She had met several people in her life who had been waiting for something to happen, and in her experience they were usually right. Fenhurst Hall stood at the end of a drive of horse-chestnuts that were, in this first week of October, turning a spectacular red gold. The house itself was Jacobean in origin, extended carelessly in the Victorian era, and now maintained with the kind of scrupulous attention that suggested its owner spent more money on it than he could comfortably afford. The gardens were immaculate. The gravel was freshly raked. "Sir Edmund Halloway," Roger said, as they passed the gateposts, "inherited about 12 years ago. The family had the Hall for 4 generations before that. He runs it. Well, he tries to run it as it was always run, if you take my meaning. The dinners, the garden parties, the Sunday luncheons." "Who comes to them?" Miss Marple asked. "Everyone in Fenhurst who matters, according to Sir Edmund. Which is to say, The Cranes from the old rectory, Dr. Petworth and his wife, Mrs. Fairway, the widow from Lavender Cottage, the Hadfield boy, George Hadfield, the estate manager's son, though why he gets invited I've never entirely understood. He paused. And Aunt Dolly, of course. She's been coming since Sir Edmund's father's time. Dolly was waiting on the doorstep of the old dower cottage where she lived, and she seized Miss Marple's hands in both of hers with an expression of such palpable relief that Miss Marple felt, not for the first time, the peculiar weight of being the person others sent for. "You came," Dolly said. "I was afraid you'd think I was going mad." "I have never thought you were going mad," Miss Marple said, which was broadly true. Inside, over tea that Dolly had kept rather too long, Miss Marple listened. Dolly could not say what was wrong. This was itself informative, because Dolly was not ordinarily a woman who struggled to express an opinion. She could say that there was a feeling at these luncheons, a performance of warmth that had something hollow at its centre. She could say that Sir Edmund smiled too often and too carefully. She could say that Mrs. Fairway, the widow, had changed in the past year, had become either very happy or very frightened, and Dolly could not tell which. She could say that at the last luncheon, 6 days ago, George Hadfield had spilled his wine and turned the colour of chalk when Sir Edmund had made a toast to old friendships. "And Dr. Petworth?" Miss Marple asked. Dolly set down her cup. "That's the other thing. Dr. Petworth has not been well. His wife says it is his heart." "But, Doctor, Petworth has had the constitution of an ox for as long as I've known him, and I've known him for 20 years. Miss Marple looked at the fire for a long moment. Insane. Mary Mead, she thought. There had been a woman, Mrs. Luttrell, who kept the post office, who had described the same feeling about her own household once. The same sense of warmth performed rather than felt. And that had been because two people in the house had understood something about each other that no one else was supposed to know. "When is the next luncheon?" she asked. "This Sunday," said Dolly. "Then," said Miss Marple, "I wonder if Sir Edmund might be persuaded to set an extra place." Sir Edmund Halloway was exactly the sort of man who would insist on setting an extra place for Miss Marple, and insist on it with a graciousness so perfectly executed that one couldn't quite find fault with it. He was 63, broad-shouldered in the manner of a man who had once been athletic, and had retained the posture, if not the fitness, with silver hair brushed back from a high forehead, and the kind of tan that came not from genuine outdoor work, but from golf and occasional winters abroad. "Any friend of Dolly's," he said, pressing Miss Marple's hand, "is a friend of Fenhurst Hall." It was Sunday. The dining room had been arranged with the care of a stage set. Autumn flowers from the garden, the good silver laid out, the table extended to accommodate 9. Miss Marple took her seat between Dolly and a large, amiable man introduced as Charles Crane, who farmed 400 acres at the edge of the village and had the hands and complexion to prove it. She spent the first 10 minutes observing. The table divided itself, as tables always do, into its true relationships. Sir Edmund anchored the head with the practised ease of a host who considers hospitality a form of authority. At his right, sat Mrs. Fairway, Cecilia Fairway, the widow, a woman of perhaps 55, with fine bones, and a way of holding her wine-glass that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with where she was sitting. Not physically uncomfortable, socially uncomfortable, in the manner of a person who has been elevated to a position they did not expect and are not yet certain they deserve. At Sir Edmund's left was Dr. Petworth. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He was in his late 60s, a large, soft-spoken man with a white moustache, and he was not well. Not theatrically unwell. He was not pale or trembling, but there was something effortful about him, a careful management of energy, as though each response cost him slightly more than it should. His wife, Marian, sat 2 places down. A compact, anxious woman who watched her husband with the specific attention of a carer who has learned to distinguish ordinary tiredness from something else. George Hadfield sat directly across from Miss Marple. He was 26 or 27, dark-haired, with the restless quality of a young man who wished he were somewhere else. He was the estate manager's son, Roger had said. The estate manager himself had died 2 years ago. George had taken over management of the Halloway lands on an informal arrangement that had apparently never been formalized. Mrs. Crane, Charles's wife, was next to George, and the last place was taken by a woman introduced simply as Miss Thorne, Agnes Thorne.
Thorne.
Sir Edmund's cousin, who lived in the village and served, Miss Marple gathered, as occasional secretary and general deputy. She was 50, angular, intelligent, and watchful in a way that she made no effort to conceal. The conversation at a Fenhurst Hall Sunday luncheon, Miss Marple observed, followed a pattern as fixed as any liturgy. Sir Edmund directed it. He introduced subjects the way a conductor cues instruments. A question about the harvest to Charles Crane, a comment about the village fed to Mrs. Crane, a solicitous inquiry about Dr. Petworth's health, to which the doctor gave a brief reassuring answer that seemed to satisfy everyone except his wife. The toast, when it came, was the moment Dolly had described. "To old friends," Sir Edmund said, lifting his glass, "and to Fenhurst, which knows how to keep its own." It was not a strange toast. Miss Marple had heard stranger, but the effect around the table was interesting. Mrs. Fairway drank quickly, as though she needed to. George Hadfield held his glass a fraction longer than everyone else before he drank, and the muscles around his jaw were tight. Agnes Thorne drank without expression, but her eyes went briefly to Sir Edmund in a way that was neither admiring nor hostile. It was the look of a person recording an event. "Only Doctor," Petworth smiled. He raised his glass with apparent warmth and drank, and it seemed to Miss Marple, though she would not have sworn to it, that Sir Edmund watched him do so. After luncheon, when the guests gathered in the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple positioned herself near the fireplace and allowed herself to be decorative. People always underestimated decorative old ladies. It was one of the chief advantages of being one. George Hadfield was standing near the window when she approached him. She admired the view of the garden. He agreed that it was very fine. They talked about the chestnuts and the autumn colour, and somewhere in the course of this entirely undemanding conversation, Miss Marple mentioned tribal, quite gently, quite idly. That she had noticed he seemed to have something on his mind. He looked at her with the startled expression of a man not accustomed to being noticed by elderly ladies. "I'm quite all right," he said. "I'm sure you are," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You remind me very much of a young man I knew once in St. Mary Mead." He had rather the same look. The look of a person who knows something that he doesn't know what to do with. A long pause. Outside, a gust of October wind moved through the chestnuts. "The young man in St. Mary Mead," she continued, "waited rather too long, which was a pity." George Hadfield looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he looked at the window. Then he said, very quietly, "I should very much like to talk to someone, but not here." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "not here." He came to Dolly's cottage the following afternoon, arriving on foot at a time when he had clearly calculated that the lane would be empty. He sat in Dolly's front room. Dolly herself having been tactfully dispatched to the garden, with his hands around a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, and told Miss Marple what he knew. It had begun, he said, 2 years ago, just before his father died. His father, Tom Hadfield, had been estate manager at Fenhurst Hall for 18 years. He had known every inch of the land, every fence post and drainage ditch, every agreement and encroachment and informal arrangement that had accumulated over the decades. And in the last months of his life, dying of a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected, he had told George one thing that George had never been able to set down anywhere. "He told me," George said, "that the Eastern Meadow isn't Sir Edmund's." Miss Marple waited. "The legal title is in a mess. It's been in a mess since Sir Edmund's grandfather's time," Dad said. "There was a sale that never got properly registered, and then a counterclaim and a settlement that was reached between the two families privately, without lawyers. The settlement was written down, but the document— Dad said he'd seen it once in Sir Edmund's study. It doesn't say what Sir Edmund says it says. What does Sir Edmund say it says? That the meadow passed to the Halloways in perpetuity. Full stop. But Dad said— He said the document actually grants use for 3 generations, and the 3rd generation would be Sir Edmund himself, at which point it reverts. To whom? George set down the untouched cup. To the Fairway family, Mrs. Fairway's family. Her maiden name was Alderton. It's the Alderton claim. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. The Eastern Meadow, she had gathered from Charles Crane at luncheon, was the most valuable agricultural land in the parish. Good heavy clay soil, well drained, the kind of field that in a good year justified itself 10 times over. "Does Mrs. Fairway know?" she asked. "I think she might. I think Sir Edmund has been very careful about Mrs. Fairway." He said this precisely, choosing words, and then stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought there was something of that kind. He's been attentive since her husband died. Very helpful, very present." George's voice was colourless. "If Mrs. Fairway were to marry Sir Edmund, any claim on the meadow would become complicated. Moot, maybe. Has she given any indication?" "She's frightened." He said it without hesitation, as though he had been certain of it for some time. "She's frightened of him, and she doesn't know she's allowed to be, if that makes sense." It made a great deal of sense to Miss Marple. She had known women like that. Women who had been handled so carefully for so long that they had stopped being able to identify the handling. "George," she said, "you mentioned your father saw this document in Sir Edmund's study. Is it still there?" A pause. "I don't know. About 3 months ago, I was asked to take some papers up to the study. Estate accounts, and Sir Edmund wasn't there. I didn't look for it deliberately, but I noticed there's a locked cabinet against the east wall. It's new. It wasn't there when my father was still working." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Dr. Petworth," she said. "What is his connection to all of this?" George looked surprised. "Dr. Petworth? He's been the village doctor for 30 years. He was Sir Edmund's father's doctor." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I imagine he was." She said nothing further about Dr. Petworth, but she thought, as she showed George out through the garden gate, about a summer fete she had attended in St. Mary Mead 40 years ago, and about a doctor she had known who had signed a death certificate with his hands shaking, not because he was lying, but because he had been made to believe, very gently, over many months, that what he had observed was less significant than what he had been told. She thought about that doctor for quite a long time after George was gone. Marion Petworth was in the church flower rota. This meant she spent Tuesday mornings arranging chrysanthemums in the nave, and it meant that the church was largely empty except for herself during those hours. And it meant that when Miss Marple walked in from the porch with a small bunch of late dahlias and an offer of assistance, Mrs. Petworth received her with more warmth than wariness. "Dolly said you might come," she said, making room at the flower table. "I'm glad. I've wanted to talk to someone, and I haven't quite known how to start." "The best method," said Miss Marple, "is usually to simply start." Marion Petworth cut the stems of her chrysanthemums with small, precise snips. She was 63, a sensible woman, the kind who had been a sensible girl, and had never seen the need to alter. She had met her husband at 20, supported him through medical school, raised 2 daughters in a succession of village surgeries, and arrived at Fenhurst Parva 15 years ago with the settled contentment of someone who has found the exact right place. "He is not well," she said. "You will have seen that. I noticed he was tired. Not tired. Careful." She said the word the same way George had said frightened, as though it had been the precise word for some time, waiting to be said aloud. "He has been careful for the last 8 months. Careful about what he eats, what he drinks, how he sleeps, as though he believes something is wrong but cannot find the source of it. Has he seen a colleague? He refuses. He says it is nothing. But Henry does not say things are nothing unless he believes they might be something." Miss Marple arranged a dahlia carefully. "Mrs. Petworth, has your husband ever spoken to you about Sir Edmund's father? About the circumstances of his death?" A silence, long enough to be its own answer. "He signed the death certificate," Marion said at last. 12 years ago. Heart failure. Sir Edmund was with him at the end. The old man had been ill for some time. No one was surprised. Henry signed it and went home and didn't speak about it for 3 days. She paused. "He hasn't spoken about it since, directly." But once, about a year after, I found him sitting in the surgery at midnight with the file open in front of him. He said he was simply reviewing old cases. But he looked the way he looked just now. Careful. Have there been any changes to your husband's health since the Sunday luncheons began? Marion turned to look at her directly. They began 8 months ago, she said. Henry's symptoms began 7 months ago. The church smelled of cold stone and late flowers. Outside, a magpie crossed the graveyard, its wings bright against the October grey. Miss Marple said, "I want you to do something that will seem strange." At this point, Marion Petworth said, "I will do almost anything. I want your husband to attend Sunday's luncheon. As usual, I want him to eat what he is served and drink what he is given. But I want you to tell him that I will be watching, and that he should trust that something is being done." She paused. Can he do that? Can he go to that table knowing what he may be going into, and not show that he knows? Marion thought about this seriously, as she thought about all things. "Henry was a GP in mining villages for 7 years before we came here," she said. "He has sat across from men who had every reason to be frightened and needed to be calm for them. Yes, he can do it." "Good," said Miss Marple. "And the death certificate? Is there a copy in his files?" "There is a copy of everything in his files. He has never thrown anything away. It is one of the things I find trying about him, and one of the things I am most grateful for at present." Miss Marple nodded. She put down the last dahlia and looked at the finished arrangement. It was, she thought, really quite well done. "One more thing," she said. "On Sunday evening, I would like to ask Inspector. I believe the local police inspector is a man named Graves." "Graves? Yes." "I would like to ask Inspector Graves to be available. Not present, but available. Within a quarter of an hour if needed." She looked at Marion Petworth steadily. "I believe we are almost at the end of something. And the ends of things, in my experience, can move faster than one expects." Agnes Thorne was the key to the cabinet. Miss Marple had known this since Sunday luncheon, when she had watched Agnes watch Sir Edmund and understood, with the clarity that came of having watched a great many people watch a great many other people, that Agnes Thorne's relationship to Sir Edmund Halloway was not the relationship she performed. She performed deference. She actually felt contempt. This was useful. Agnes lived in a stone cottage on the far side of the village green, half hidden by a copper beech that had outgrown all proportion. She received Miss Marple on Wednesday morning with the brisk non-surprise of someone who had been expecting a visit from some direction or other. "Dolly Prescott's friend," she said. "Come in." The cottage was the opposite of Fenhurst Hall. Personal, slightly chaotic, full of books and plants, and the evidence of a woman who lived primarily in her own mind. Agnes made coffee efficiently, and sat down without waiting to be asked, and looked at Miss Marple with the direct attention of someone who had stopped bothering with social preliminaries some years ago. "You want to know about the cabinet," she said. Miss Marple permitted herself a small smile. "What makes you think so? Because you are methodical. You have spoken to George Hadfield. He told me. I asked him directly. You have spoken to Marion Petworth. I imagine, because Marion Petworth has the information about Henry's health that explains your interest in the dinners. The next logical step is the document itself, and the document is in the cabinet, and I have a key to the cabinet because I have a key to everything in that house. Sir Edmund finds it useful to be able to say that he depends entirely upon me, and impossible to imagine otherwise. A brief, arid pause. He is wrong about that, as about much. You have read it, Miss Marple said. Of course I have read it. I read everything. It is what I am there for. Agnes set down her coffee. The Eastern Meadow reverts to the Alderton heirs upon the death of the last Halloway of the third generation. Sir Edmund is the last Halloway of the third generation. The document is clear, the phrasing is clear, a second-year law student would find it clear. The only ambiguity Sir Edmund has been banking on is that no one else knows it exists. And Mrs. Fairway. Cecilia doesn't know. She has no idea her family had any claim on the land. She was a child when it all happened. Her parents are dead. There was never any reason for anyone to tell her. Agnes's expression was controlled, but not warm. Sir Edmund began his campaign of attention towards her approximately 2 weeks after his lawyer, a new lawyer, not the old family firm, told him that discovery of the document could constitute fraud if he continued selling crop rights on that land without disclosure. So the purpose of the attention is marriage. The purpose of the attention is silencing. Marriage would serve, yes, or simply rendering Mrs. Fairway sufficiently grateful and emotionally entangled that she would not pursue any claim even if she became aware of one. Agnes looked out at the copper beach. He is not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He is a man to whom Fenhurst Hall is more real than other people are. Miss Marple thought of 2 or 3 men she had known of whom that had been true, and of the things they had been capable of in consequence. Dr. Petworth, she said, the Sunday luncheons. Something is being introduced into what he eats or drinks. I don't know that. Agnes said it firmly. I suspect it. I don't know it. What I know is that Henry Petworth signed a death certificate 12 years ago that he has regretted ever since, and that Sir Edmund is aware of this regret, and that a man like Sir Edmund does not allow useful knowledge to go to waste. She paused. But I have no evidence. I have only a feeling in your bones, Miss Marple said. Agnes looked at her sharply. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a single short sound, more like a release of breath. What do you need from me? She said. Miss Marple spent Thursday in Dolly's kitchen, which was peaceful, warm, and large enough to contain Dolly's running commentary on the history of every family in Fenhurst, without feeling crowded. She was making notes. Not in any form that would have struck an observer as notes, but in the manner she had always used, which was to write small observations in the margins of whatever book she happened to be reading, connected by no system that anyone else could have decoded. What she knew precisely arranged. Sir Edmund Halloway had in his possession a document proving that the Eastern Meadow was not his to sell, lease, or otherwise dispose of. He had been selling crop rights on this land for 11 years. His lawyer had recently made him aware that this constituted potential fraud. His response had been, first, to begin cultivating Mrs. Fairway, the heir to the Alderton claim, and second, to ensure the continued cooperation of Dr. Henry Petworth, who had signed the death certificate of Sir Edmund's father under circumstances that had troubled him ever since. The troubling of Dr. Petworth was the part that needed unpacking. Old Sir Reginald Halloway had died of heart failure. This was almost certainly true. Hearts failed all the time. They were, Miss Marple had always felt, unreliable organs. The question was not whether Sir Reginald had died of heart failure, but whether the heart failure had been assisted, and if it had been assisted, whether Dr. Petworth had suspected this and signed the certificate anyway, perhaps out of genuine uncertainty, perhaps under pressure, and whether this fact was now being used to ensure that Dr. Petworth said nothing inconvenient about anything. The deterioration in Dr. Petworth's health over the last 7 months was, she believed, being induced. This was a strong thing to believe. She did not believe it lightly. The mechanism, she thought, was elegant in its simplicity. The Sunday luncheons were the vehicle. Sir Edmund personally served the wine to his guests. She had watched this on Sunday, noted it as a gracious, old-fashioned custom, filed it. Sir Edmund served the wine, and he served Dr. Petworth's glass himself from a separate bottle, not conspicuously, not obtrusively, but she had seen it. The bottle was there on the sideboard, opened ahead of time, with a label suggesting it was the same as the table wine. She would very much like to have that bottle examined. The substance, she suspected, was one she had read about in a gardening context. Not a poison in the dramatic sense, but a compound present in certain ornamental plants that, in small accumulated doses, produced exactly the constellation of symptoms Marion Petworth had described. Fatigue, careful tiredness, a creeping alteration of the heart's rhythm, difficult to detect unless one was looking for it specifically. Sir Edmund had a large and well-maintained garden. He also had, Agnes had told her, a competent and unsupervised laboratory of sorts. A potting shed fitted out with the equipment of a man who took his horticulture seriously. The purpose was not to kill Dr. Petworth. The purpose was to make Dr. Petworth afraid, to make him feel every day the possible consequence of speaking. Fear was more controllable than death. You could increase it or decrease it as required. Miss Marple wrote none of this in her margin notes. She kept it in the place where she kept such things, which was a quiet and well-organized room in her mind that she did not often let others into. In St. Mary Mead, she thought, old Mr. Hargreaves had kept his tenants cooperative in roughly the same way. Not by threatening them openly, but by making them aware, through small and deniable demonstrations, that their comfort depended on his goodwill. The mechanism was different. The psychology was identical. She wrote to Inspector Graves on Friday morning. A short letter, giving him nothing that could be called accusation, asking only that he make himself available on Sunday evening, and that he have on hand the authority to call in a medical analyst, should one be needed. She also asked Agnes Thorne to do one thing on Saturday, while Sir Edmund was at the golf club in Ipswich. Agnes would need only 5 minutes in the study, and she had done more complicated things than that. Agnes, when asked, said simply, "All right." The day was clear and cold, the air carrying the smell of turned earth and bonfire smoke that belonged specifically to October in the English countryside. The chestnuts were past their best now, the gold beginning to darken, and the gravel of the hall drive held a scatter of fallen leaves that the gardener had not yet swept. Miss Marple arrived on Dolly's arm, which was accurate. Dolly was 81, and her balance on gravel was genuinely uncertain, and also useful, because a lady supporting a slightly frail friend attracts no particular scrutiny. The group in the drawing-room was as it had been. Charles and Patricia Crane, bluff and comfortable. Agnes Thorne, angular and present. George Hadfield, standing near the window with his careful stillness. Mrs. Fairway, her fine-boned hands holding a glass of sherry with the precise calibration of a woman monitoring her own composure. Doctor and Marion Petworth, the doctor looking tired but steady, his wife's eyes moving quietly around the room, and Sir Edmund moving through them all like a man conducting an orchestra he had written himself. He greeted Miss Marple with warm and genuine-seeming pleasure. He had, she noted, the gift of making attention feel like a gift rather than a calculation. Mrs. Fairway had this effect on Sir Edmund. She could see, had been receiving this gift for 8 months, and had confused it with friendship, possibly with something more, in the way that people confused care with love, when the care was consistent and the loneliness was real. "I'm delighted you could join us again," Sir Edmund said. "I do hope your finding Fenhurst agrees with you." "Very much," said Miss Marple. "It is an extraordinary village. So much history, pressed together in such a small space." Something flickered, briefly, in his eyes. Not quite recognition of danger, not yet, but the awareness of an unexpected note. "All English villages are that," he said pleasantly, and moved on. At table she watched. Sir Edmund served the wine from the decanter for the table and from the separate bottle for Dr. Petworth, and she watched George Hadfield watch this. And she watched Agnes Thorne watch this, and she noted that Marion Petworth's hand touched her husband's wrist once, briefly, as his glass was poured. The toast, "To old friends and to Fenhurst." Dr. Petworth raised his glass. He held it for a fraction of a second, his eyes moving to Miss Marple across the table. She gave a very small nod. He drank. Later she would think that it was at the moment of that nod that Sir Edmund knew. Not the substance of what was happening. He could not have known the substance, but the fact of it. Some alteration in the room's temperature. Some alignment of attention among people who should have had no connection to each other. He smiled throughout the luncheon with undiminished warmth, but the smile no longer reached quite as far as his eyes. The afternoon proceeded. Coffee in the drawing-room. Conversation about the coming winter, about a planning application for new houses at the edge of the village, about Charles Crane's bull. Miss Marple sat near the fire and was decorative and listened, and when the guests began to leave in ones and twos, she stayed. Dolly stayed also. George stayed because Miss Marple had asked him to stay. Dr. and Marion Petworth stayed. Sir Edmund, when he noticed, began. for the first time in Miss Marple's observation of him, to be genuinely still. Agnes Thorne had not left the drawing-room. She was sitting near the window with a cup of cold coffee, and she met Sir Edmund's eyes when he looked at her, and she did not look away. "Well," said Sir Edmund, "what a pleasant afternoon to extend." "Yes, isn't it?" said Miss Marple. "I wonder, Sir Edmund, if I might ask you something. It will only take a few minutes." She asked it gently. She always asked things gently. It was one of the advantages of having a manner that had been formed in an era that considered directness in women to be a form of failure. One could be entirely direct while appearing to be entirely gentle, and the combination was often more effective than either quality alone. "I should like to talk about your father," she said. Sir Edmund, sitting opposite her with his long legs crossed and his hands composed in his lap, permitted himself a brief expression of confusion. "My father has been dead for 12 years. Yes, he died quite suddenly, I understand. Though he had been ill, he had a heart condition. Doctor Petworth had been treating him for it." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I understand that Dr. Petworth found the circumstances of his death somewhat." She paused, tilting her head as though searching for the word unspected. A silence. "Dr. Petworth," said Sir Edmund, "signed the death certificate without reservation." "He did. Though not, I think, without some private uncertainty." She looked at Dr. Petworth, who sat quietly beside his wife, his large hands on his knees. "I think you have been anxious about that for some time, haven't you, Dr. Petworth?" Henry Petworth looked at Sir Edmund steadily. "Yes," he said, "I have." The room settled into a quality of attention that Miss Marple had encountered before. The attention of people who have been pretending not to know something and have suddenly been released from the pretense. She set out what she knew, quietly and in order. The document in the locked cabinet. Agnes produced her copy of it, taken on Saturday, while Sir Edmund had been at golf, which was the thing she had asked Agnes to do. The Alderton claim, Mrs. Fairway's position as the unknowing inheritor of a right that had been kept from her by a campaign of careful and calculated attention. Mrs. Fairway, as she heard this, had gone very still. Not pale, she had gone a kind of translucent, as though what was beneath were becoming visible. She did not look at Sir Edmund. She looked at her hands. "The wine," Miss Marple continued, "or rather the separate bottle of wine prepared for Dr. Petworth. I believe Inspector Graves, if asked, would find that it contains traces of something derived from digitalis purpurea. Foxglove, in quantities carefully calibrated to produce ill health without producing anything immediately diagnosable." She looked at Sir Edmund. "The foxglove in your garden is of the ornamental variety. Your potting shed is very well equipped." Sir Edmund had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not guilt, not panic, but the expression of a man who has just understood what kind of opponent he has been playing against, and is revising his assessment. "This is a remarkable collection of theories," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Inspector Graves is waiting at the end of your drive. I asked him to come at 5 o'clock. It is now just past 5. She paused. I want to be clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying at present that you killed your father. I am saying that Dr. Petworth believed he may have witnessed, in the weeks before your father's death, certain signs that were consistent with slow poisoning, and that he signed a certificate he has regretted signing ever since, and that you have used this regret to ensure his silence. That I can say with confidence." Another pause. "The meadow," said George Hadfield from his place near the window. His voice was quiet and level. "The document shows the meadow reverts. 11 years of crop rights sold on land that wasn't yours to sell." Mrs. Fairway looked up. She looked at George. She looked at the copy of the document that Agnes had placed on the side table. She looked, finally, at Sir Edmund, and Miss Marple saw the moment at which the careful architecture of the last 8 months collapsed inside her. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but completely. "Cecilia," Sir Edmund began. "Don't," she said, quietly, "entirely." Inspector Graves was a competent man with an incurious face, and the slightly resigned air of a detective who had been called in by elderly lady visitors before, and had learned, through experience, to take them seriously. He arrived with a sergeant and a laboratory contact in Ipswich, and, within 2 days, confirmed that the bottle of wine from Sir Edmund's sideboard contained an extract of Digitalis purpurea at a concentration consistent with the production of chronic cardiac symptoms, if administered repeatedly over a period of months. What followed was slower and messier than the moment of confrontation, as such things always are. Sir Edmund retained a solicitor, a good one, from London, and the legal proceedings occupied themselves with the question of intent, which is always the complicated part. Miss Marple was not required to give formal evidence. She gave it informally to Inspector Graves over the course of 2 long afternoons in Dolly's front room, with tea that Dolly kept at the correct temperature this time. The death of old Sir Reginald was reopened. Henry Petworth gave a full statement, in the careful, exhausted voice of a man finally setting down something very heavy, describing what he had observed in the months before Sir Reginald's death, and what he had suspected and what he had done, or rather had failed to do, when presented with a death certificate to sign. He had been young and uncertain and frightened, and Edmund Halloway had been composed and convincing, and had offered a perfectly plausible alternative explanation for every symptom. Henry had believed what it was easier to believe. He had believed it for 12 years. Miss Marple, thinking about this in Dolly's garden on a cold October afternoon, found herself without the judgment that the situation might have seemed to invite. Henry Petworth was not a weak man. He was a man who had made a mistake under pressure, at a moment when the truth was genuinely ambiguous, and who had spent 12 years paying for it in a private currency of doubt. That Sir Edmund had then compounded the original crime with a methodical programme of pharmaceutical intimidation was, she thought, the more revealing act. The original crime might have been, at a stretch, the act of a frightened man acting quickly. The 7 months of accumulated foxglove extract were the act of a man utterly in control of himself, who had considered his options and selected the most efficient. George Hadfield came to see her on the Thursday before she left for St. Mary Mead. He brought some late apples from the Hall orchard. The Hall was being managed by a temporary agent while the legal situation sorted itself out, and sat in the kitchen with the ease of someone who had, in the last week, grown considerably older and was managing this reasonably well. "Mrs. Fairway is all right," he said. "In case you were wondering, she's gone to stay with her sister in Bath for a month. She said she felt as if she'd been asleep and had woken up." He turned one of the apples in his hands. "I think that's about right." "It is about right," Miss Marple said. "The meadow will take years to sort out legally." He looked up. "I don't think she cares much about the meadow, really. I think it's more." He stopped. "The knowledge that someone saw her clearly," Miss Marple said, "and thought it worth acting on." He looked at her with young man surprise at finding his thought completed. "Yes," he said, "that's it exactly." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in the last of the October light. In St. Mary Mead, she thought, there had been a woman, Mrs. Hartley, who kept the sweet shop, who had been managed in rather the same way, for rather the same reason, for a very long time. The difference was that no one had gone to Fenhurst for Mrs. Hartley. The difference was Dolly and her bones, and a letter written with the specific courage of an old woman who trusted that her oldest friend would come. This was not a small thing. Miss Marple thought it was, in fact, quite a large thing. She left on a Monday. Roger drove her to the Holt station in the old Ford, and the branch line train was 7 minutes late, which gave her time to stand on the narrow platform and look at the village one last time from this small elevation. The church tower, the copper beech over Agnes Thorne's cottage, the far-off line of chestnuts that marked the drive to Fenhurst Hall. Dolly had pressed sandwiches on her, and a small pot of the quince jelly she made every October, and had held her hands for rather a long time before letting go. "Will you come back?" Dolly asked. "I don't know," Miss Marple said, which was the honest answer. On the train, she thought about the things that had not been resolved. They were worth thinking about. The things that resolved neatly were satisfying, but it was the things that did not resolve, which were, in her experience, the truest indication of how a situation had actually stood. Sir Edmund's father. The reopened case would almost certainly not produce a prosecution. 12 years was a long time. The original evidence was gone. What remained was Henry Petworth's belated account of symptoms he had observed and not reported, and a pattern of behaviour that was consistent with guilt, but not provable as cause. The coroner's office in Ipswich was cautious, as coroners' offices tend to be. They would note the new information. They would not, most likely, act on it. This troubled Miss Marple, not because she required every wrong to be prosecuted. She had lived long enough to know that the law and justice were not the same measurement, and that conflating them caused its own particular kind of damage. It troubled her because old Sir Reginald Halloway had been, by all accounts, a man of ordinary decency, who had loved his garden, and kept a good table and been reasonably kind to his tenants. and he had almost certainly died because his son could not wait, and he would not be formally acknowledged as a victim. She thought about this and accepted it, as she had accepted many such things over the years, and turned to the sandwich, which was the good kind with proper mustard. Mrs. Fairway, the legal claim on the Eastern Meadow, would take years, as George had said, and would be expensive, and would almost certainly settle before it reached court. Cecilia Fairway would receive, most likely, a sum of money and a legal acknowledgment that she had been deceived. This was not nothing. It was also not the same as the 8 months she had spent, without knowing it, being shaped by a careful program of gratitude and dependency. That 8 months was simply a thing that had happened to her, and it would not be undone. She would be all right. Miss Marple thought she would be all right. She had, at the end, said, "Don't," very quietly and entirely, which was the response of a woman who was fundamentally intact. Agnes Thorne had given notice at Fenhurst Hall the day after the confrontation. She told Miss Marple before she left, going to London to work for a firm that did land rights litigation. She said this without either drama or triumph, in the manner of someone completing a necessary task. "You've been wasted in that study," Miss Marple told her. "I was never wasted," Agnes said. "I was watching." Miss Marple had found this the most satisfying thing anyone had said throughout the entire business. Dr. Petworth was already improving. Off the Sunday luncheons, off whatever had been introduced into the specially prepared wine, his symptoms were receding week by week. Marion had written to say that Henry was sleeping properly for the first time in months, and had gone back to his evening walk and had begun, quietly, to rebuild the part of himself he had lent to shame for 12 years. This last was the thing that mattered most, Miss Marple thought, folding Marion's letter back into her bag. Not the legal proceedings, not the document, not the meadow. The rebuilding. It was slow work, and unglamorous, and no one would write about it, and it was the most important thing. The train moved through the Suffolk countryside, the fields brown now and ready, the sky the particular wide grey of October in the east of England. Miss Marple looked out at it, and thought, as she often thought when leaving somewhere, that the world was full of places where things had almost gone wrong, and had not gone quite as wrong as they might have, because someone had paid attention. It was not a cheerful thought, precisely, but it was a sustaining one. She opened her mending bag. She had not touched the mending in 10 days, and it had accumulated considerably. And she felt, as she always did, returning to it, a small and genuine pleasure in the prospect of restoring things to the shape they were meant to be. The train moved on. Fenhurst Parva fell away behind her and was gone.